to be in the same postcode as you. I'll tell you things I know you'd like to know. Treat you to cake every night. Suddenly talk, then it'll make you cry. Smile at me, I'll hold you really tight. I'll follow you in the bed, run around until morning, and we'll stay awake every night. We repeat the same story, but across, never in front of friends. How it all started in the kitchen. Remember the time when you said we should wait a while, but let me know when you change your mind. Yeah, I was sad for some time, but 12 hours watching me at the wheel made me realize what you really feel. Don't have to hurt anymore, run around until morning, and we'll stay awake all night. We repeat the same story, but of course never in front of friends. How it all started in the kitchen.
Hi, everyone. Today we'll be wrapping up Gary Allen Fine's Kitchens, looking at the last couple chapters for today's class presentation. And as we move forward, we'll talk about the book, but also reference the in-class assignment and also look at the book report as well. So just to begin our recap, we're looking at kitchens, and Gary Allen Fine is continuing the American social thought threads that we talked about throughout the semester, focusing on that micro level of analysis, looking at individuals and how they navigate their social worlds. And what I've referred to this as is looking at the social psychology of social organization. So how organization unfolds, but all the social psychological dynamics that go into the unfolding of social organization. So again, kind of going back and forth between the social level and the personal level, and taken together, we can say, generally speaking, we're looking at a theory of social organization. Specifically, he's trying to explain the creation of social order in restaurants. And in doing so, he's looking at the interplay between the personal and the social and how that interplay comes together to establish functionality in terms of creating that social order in restaurants, making restaurants functional rather than dysfunctional, creating order in restaurants rather than disorder emerging. So again, although the focus is on restaurant work, we can apply this framework to other work forms and to other organizations as well. You can see the personal and social dynamics kind of coming together to create functionality and to create order within those different types of work and different organizations as well. Your last set of readings looked at how order in the kitchen is a combination of three different types, three different forms of order. So we looked at physical order, looking at the physical space, the physical equipment that people have to work with, and then social order, the different roles and responsibilities of workers when they're in their roles. And then we looked at symbolic order, the overall kind of social recognition and respect within the restaurant space. So the symbolic, social, and physical orders all need to function properly to create overall order. So in other words, if everybody's not doing their roles and responsibilities, then even though you may have the proper equipment, still nothing's going to get done. Dysfunction is going to occur. Likewise, maybe everybody wants to do their jobs, but they don't have enough space, they don't have the proper equipment to do it. then again, there's going to be more disorder than order. So all three types of order need to be there to establish functionality overall. And we looked at how there are different barriers that emerge, different limitations that emerge within each different order, and how the workers have to navigate those barriers, navigate the limitations to overall kind of navigate the tension that can emerge when those barriers, those limitations exist. So, for example, we talked about how you can navigate space issues by limiting the people within certain spaces of the restaurant, perhaps at certain times when people can be in, when people can't. We looked at how you can compromise with your tools, or you can bring your own if you're not happy with the equipment that you have. So, again, just kind of navigating these different limitations, barriers, and when you do so, you can navigate the tension that can come along with these barriers. So again, we're looking at social order. To navigate the tension, you have to think about performing your duties, not for the paycheck or the status of your job, but you're doing it for the team. It's all about kind of we rather than me. And then you will kind of help each other out when help is needed. And so if things are getting a little bit crazy for one person, then perhaps somebody in a different role will kind of step out of their role and kind of help out that person. And then we talked about how sometimes you can let people vent, or perhaps you bite your tongue when you do want to vent. So again, all these different strategies to navigate different tensions that can emerge within the social order. So finally, we talked about the symbolic order and how the tension can emerge when people are not kind of respecting the chain of command. So when this occurs, you have to sanction workers, you have to punish them, and then to kind of get your respect, you have to earn it through your hard work and through respecting others. So again, there's different ways to navigate tension when tension can emerge in that symbolic realm of the restaurant. Staying on the topic of creating order, of creating that functionality, he not only kind of breaks down the three different forms of order, but also talks about why people want to navigate those tensions within the orders. So in other words, why are people going to compromise? Why are people going to do their roles and responsibilities, help each other out? And why will people respect the chain of command and respect their fellow workers? And he says this doesn't happen by chance. What actually occurs is there's a work culture that develops within restaurants. And again, you can apply this to other places as well, but there's a work culture that develops. And as a result of this work culture, it encourages people to avoid tension. It encourages people to navigate any issues that can be dysfunctional, that can be problematic for the individuals at the restaurant, for the restaurant as a whole. So when looking at this work culture, it's a product of different interpersonal practices. Basically, it talks about play and the different forms of play that occur at work, such as joking around, the socializing, coming up with your own language and nicknames, and the different forms of play, these interpersonal practices come together at that micro level to build a work culture at the macro level. And it's this work culture that encourages people to navigate the tensions because you create an environment where people do have each other's back, where people do want the good on the collective level rather than only focusing on the good at that personal level. Today's readings will be looking at how the restaurant employees will navigate different social structures kind of outside the co-workers' work itself. So we'll see some overlap with what we talked about with the earlier chapters, but here we're kind of looking at structural forces that are, we can say, kind of outside of the kitchen area or outside, excuse me, of the restaurant itself. So, just like we talked about before, these barriers, these limitations have to be navigated successfully for the restaurant to be successful as a whole. And so, specifically, we can look at economic limitations, issues of money and finance, and then also we can look at aesthetic limitations. And here we're talking about personal social standards of taste, and also we can look at kind of the restaurant status itself and how that relates to aesthetic limitations. So we'll get into both of these here in the next couple slides, but kind of keep in mind again what we're talking about is that interplay between what's going on the personal level, the workers, and how they're trying to manage the tension that occurs when you encounter these aesthetic or economic limitations. And so when looking at the economic limitations, we'll talk about kind of external factors outside of the restaurant, and also internal factors, internal forces being what's going on inside the restaurant related to money and financial issues. Looking at the economic limitations, again, we can break them down into external limitations and of forces that are larger than the restaurant itself, kind of outside of the restaurant, and then internal forces, things that are going on within the restaurant regarding economic limitations. So no matter outside or inside the restaurant, these economic limitations need to be navigated to, again, avoid any of these potential tensions that could emerge and could be overall dysfunctional for the business, tensions that can lead to disorder rather than order in the restaurant. So looking at external limitations, market forces need to be navigated. And market forces, we're looking at, the bigger economy picture, being able to pay your employees, being able to purchase what you need in terms of equipment, in terms of food, in terms of furniture, and things like paying rent. And so what you try to do in the restaurant industry, because again it's a tough one to survive long term, you focus on cutting your losses more so than creating big profits. So you find ways to kind of cut losses and make sure you're not spending any extra money rather than trying to focus on making a lot of profit. And then another external force could be customers. So here the idea is simply without customers, you won't have a business very long. So, the book talks about many different ways you can attract customers. You want to kind of target the right type of audience for your restaurant. Also, you want to establish trust and loyalty with your customers. So the idea is you want to create, the regulars, people that will come to your restaurant on a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly basis, and they'll be kind of the main revenue source. And so you need to establish that trust and loyalty with the customers, and you do that by treating them nicely, making them feel special. And once you kind of start to create the regulars, that's a good kind of source of revenue to get the business going and to keep the business going. And finally, we could talk about the media being an external force. Here, you kind of navigate potential tensions by trying to receive good press, but also you want to avoid bad press in the media. And so bad press can really do damage to a business. It can make people stop going there or can prevent people from going there in the first place. So you want to avoid that, but to your best ability, try to get good press. And so moving away from the external limitations, we can look at internal limitations. So pricing, how you want to navigate issues of pricing would be you want to come up with this idea that it's a fair pricing. Fair in the sense that you're making enough money to pay the bills, but also the customer believes that they're getting a fair price on whatever they're receiving. So they're getting their money's worth on the customer end, and fair in the sense that you believe you're getting your money's worth in terms of trying to create profit. And when you strike that balance, if people don't feel that you're overcharging them for the food, and you don't feel like you're giving your food away. So, in addition to pricing, debt is another kind of internal issue, and you want to avoid taking on heavy amounts of debt as much as you can. And the book talks about finding good deals, and so often a good deal that could allow you to take on more debt than you would otherwise would be moving into spaces that were previously restaurants. So rather than creating your restaurant space from scratch, you can move into a space that kind of structurally speaking, that's already organized, that's already set up for the restaurant work, for the restaurant experience. You could move into a place that already has the equipment that you need, rather than you have to buy your own equipment. And so when you do those things, you kind of are finding good deals. You're taking on less debt than you would otherwise in terms of having to buy everything, create everything from scratch. And so another factor we can look at is labor cost. And so labor cost, you want to try to keep them down as low as you can. And so often what you do is try to keep the wages of your workers at kind of the lowest level that you can. Not trying to say you're exploiting your workers, but again, you want to kind of pay them at a certain rate that you believe you can make a profit on. And sometimes that means kind of letting people go who perhaps are demanding more money, or perhaps they're replaceable in the sense that you can easily kind of get rid of perhaps your cook who's been around for 5-10 years and gets paid more compared to the cook who you hire on day one. So you kind of let people go, and in replace of them you hire people and pay them lower wages, and then you would pay kind of the longer term, more experienced workers. And in addition to keeping the labor costs low, you want to keep food costs low as well. And some of the strategies here is you reuse food, not in the sense that you know you don't throw away food, but you reuse that instead. But when we say you reuse it, back in the kitchen, you just don't kind of throw away all scraps. You can find ways to, take kind of what's left over of meal preparations and include that in other forms of food, such as soups and the like. And also, you just kind of reduce, sometimes you can reduce the amounts of food that you actually are serving. So the less food that you're serving, the more you're kind of reducing that, and that can save you in terms of food cost overall. So again, these are these kind of structural forces larger than the individual, the economic limitations, whether it be kind of the external or internal social structures. And we're seeing how people, through their agency, through their free will, have to navigate these limitations, to navigate the tensions emerging as a whole. Again, those tensions that can lead to unhappy workers, can lead to unhappy customers, and overall lead to a business failing. Looking at the aesthetic limitations, we're looking at issues of taste, whether it be kind of taste of the customer or taste of the workers. and how the issues of taste and kind of personal or perhaps social expectations come into play, and they can actually create barriers and limitations that, again, you do have to navigate to avoid that tension that you want to avoid overall. The tension that can be, again, bad for business if you're upsetting the customer, bad for business if the workers are going to be unhappy. So, looking at customer taste first, often the taste of the customer is not going to be the same taste of the chef or the cook. Typically, the cook, the chef, coming from a more trained, uh, more versed background in food, have kind of different personal standards compared to the standards of the customer. So, what they'll do to try to kind of make the customer happy is often do things like undercook and underseason the food. And they do this because it's much easier to cook it more or add more season to it compared to the alternative of taking seasoning away or trying to take some of the cooking off of it. Once it's on there, once it's been cooked, you can't undo it. So sometimes what you do is to try to make the customer happy is undercook and underseason. So if they prefer something that's well done, they can send it back, or they prefer something that's seasoned a little bit more, and then they can season it more themselves, or again, they can send it back for some more seasoning in the kitchen. And what they'll often do is serve the customers bad food. And by bad food, we're not saying that the food itself is bad, but more in the sense that it's perhaps something that the chef, perhaps something that the cook would never eat themselves. So, in their mind, this food isn't good, but, if the customers want this food, then we'll serve it to them. And I remember one of the guys that I know who runs a restaurant downtown. When they opened originally, he said that they weren't going to have any chicken and waffles on the menu. He just didn't want to. He said that was kind of too trendy, or for a reason. He said, I don't want that. But eventually, with the second version, the menu came out, so chicken and waffles was on the menu because, again, that's kind of what the customers wanted. So you have to kind of serve what in your mind, so maybe not the best food, but serve the food that the customers do want. And so another limitation can be time. In terms of a chef's or a cook's kind of personal aesthetic expectations, often they'll want to do more than they are allowed to do. In terms of, if you have all the time in the world, you could make a piece of art. You could really craft your food to taste and look a certain way. But often you don't have all the time in the world, so you can't spend all this time making it making it appear a certain way. Although perhaps that's what you like to do as a cook, that's what you want to do as a chef. And so again, kind of time issues. You can have low prep items, so things that aren't going to take too long, and thus aren't going to be backing you up, making the customers wait. And then also you kind of lower your creativity. So again, if you had all the time in the world, maybe you could get really creative with the food, but you don't have all the time in the world, so you're gonna have to lower your personal expectations and lower the creativity actually putting into to the food you're making. And then we can look at the limitation of a restaurant status. Here, basically, when we go to certain places to eat, we have certain expectations of what we should be getting, what we shouldn't be getting. So if you go to kind of a higher end restaurant, you have expectations that the food is going to look more creative. It's going to be on a different aesthetic level compared to if you're going to a diner, or if you're going to an Olive Garden or a chain restaurant like that. When you go to the Olive Garden, you just want your pasta and bread and a lot of it. And if they try to get too creative or too cute with the food, then that's not what you want. I didn't come to the Olive Garden to see my food representing a piece of art. But if you go to, again, the higher end places, you're not expecting this idea of, I want a lot of food and a lot of bread or whatever. You're going to perhaps pay more and get less quantity wise, but there's a quality aspect in terms of taste and visual appeal that you're looking for at that restaurant. So here again, the chefs, the cooks have to kind of stay within the range that the restaurant imposes upon them. If you're a cook at the Olive Garden, maybe you're a really good cook with a lot of skills, but again, you have to kind of limit what you do to fit the expectations of the customer, to fit the expectations of your restaurant status. And on the other hand, perhaps you don't like being so creative with food, but if you find yourself working at a higher end restaurant, you kind of have to give, again, the people what they want, meet that restaurant status, and up your creativity game. Although personally, you don't maybe think the food needs to go to that level, but again, you do it to kind of stay within the expectations attached to your restaurant to meet the expectations of the customers. Now, running down the book in reference to some of the book report parts, just a couple things. Just reflecting on the first book report you turned in and where some people lost points. So just make sure to fully explain your thoughts. Make sure that you're referring to the book using examples that kind of show the reader what you're talking about, and be specific. So don't be general with your thoughts. Kind of show the reader what you're talking about and really unpack your ideas, and don't just assume that the reader knows what you're getting at or knows what you're talking about. Be specific and fully develop your thoughts. So overall, getting into the construction of reality, the theme that we've been talking about throughout these presentations is the drive behind the reality of the creation of order in the restaurants is that people are trying to avoid the different types of tension that can create disorder. The personal tensions, among coworkers or between the customer and the worker. You want to avoid those tensions, and also the social tensions that can emerge in terms of not being able to navigate economic limitations or aesthetic limitations. So basically, again, kind of carrying on that tradition of American social thought that we've talked about, the idea of trying to manage, avoid different types of tension is the driving force behind the reality in Fine's book. Basically, the action of creating social order in the restaurant is there because people are trying to avoid the disorders. So when looking at social structures, all these social structures that we were talking about relate to those barriers and limitations, the different aspects of restaurant work that create the barriers and limitations, that can create the tension. So whether it be time as a social structure, whether it be food cost, labor cost, whether it be the customer taste, all those things that we've been talking about over the last couple of presentations represent social structures that are larger than the people, larger than the cook, larger than the chef, larger than the restaurant workers. So those social structures are what you have to navigate to be successful, to avoid those tensions from emerging. And in reference to those social structures, we're talking about the elements of agency. So how people manage those aspects. So how you manage, creating a loyal customer base, how you manage satisfying customers, how you manage issues of time and space. So the social structures are those kind of barriers and limitations, and how you respond to those barriers and limitations shows the free will and shows the agency. And so in reference to the macro and micro, again, when we're focusing on those elements of agency, that's that micro level approach. when you're focusing on people interacting with one another to build a culture. That's that micro approach. But when you focus on the work culture as a whole, or when you're focusing on the social structures, those barriers, that's when you're taking that macro directional focus, top down. So again, the rule of thumb is simply when you're focusing on the social structures, that's that micro. When you're focusing on social structures, that's that macro directional focus. And then when you're focusing on agency, you're focusing on the micro level. So here again, just make sure with the micro and macro, you're fully discussing, fully unpacking your ideas. Then you can always, feel free to refer to, an earlier part in your paper. So, if you're talking about social structures or you're talking about agency, you can say in your paper, for example, as mentioned earlier, when Fine is looking at how people manage customer loyalty, he's looking at the kind of micro level of analysis. Or, for example, as I mentioned earlier, when Fine is focusing on work culture, he is focusing on that macro directional approach. So otherwise, a few people lost points with the comparison. So here again, I'll stress that you want to fully explain your ideas, fully explain for the reader the similarities, the differences. Again, don't assume that the reader is going to know what you're talking about. Make sure that you're filling in all the blanks for them. So I'll leave that there for today. And as always, I'll be happy to look at any drafts, full drafts, half drafts of papers as you get started.